Happy to have you join us. I'm Liz Benesky with AmSham Abu Dhabi, and we're so lucky today to be joined by Dr. Nouriel Roubini. And what we'll be hearing from him is his thoughts on what's currently going on globally and in the region as he sees it from his point of view. This will likely have a lot of Q&A. So what I'd like to ask all of you is, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. We're going to allot at least 15 to 20 minutes for your questions, and I'll be moderating that at the end of Dr. Roubini's comments. So we can maximize our time. Without further ado, you've all read his bio. It's my pleasure and an honor to introduce Dr. Roubini. Doctor, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure being back to the Gulf region. I spent a few days in Dubai. Today I'm in Abu Dhabi. By Sunday I'll be in Saudi Arabia. So I hadn't traveled very much for the last year or so because of COVID. Now things are gradually reopening as well. So it's great to be here and having a chance to have this dialogue. And hopefully next time we can also see each other in person. I want to give a bit of an outlook of how I see the US and the global economy and policy issues and maybe some of the market implication. And of course, everybody's mind is on what's going to be the shape of the recovery. Is this going to be a very strong V-shaped recovery, the way most analysts think about it, and in which parts of the world could be more anemic, subpar, more like a U? What's the risk even of a double dip recession, like the one we're seeing right now in some parts of Europe and the Eurozone? And to think about what's going to be the outlook for the next few quarters, I think it's worth starting with a brief retrospective on what happened in the last year, since the beginning of the COVID crisis. As you know, this was the most severe recession that we had in the global economy since World War II. That was the bad news. And in the first and the second quarter of last year, there was a free fall of economic activity. You ask yourself, what was the shape of the recession? It was like an eye, free fall. Output, employment, demand, supply, export, imports, consumption, investment, they're free falling in a synchronized way. First in China, then in Europe, then US, then other emerging markets, because of course, we had to shut down through a policy-induced coma most economies as a way of stopping the spread of the virus and try to flatten the curve. So it was a free fall. Then by the second half of the year, there was a recovery. And the recovery was driven by the fact that on one side, once the virus was contained, people thought we can reopen soon. And unfortunately, we reopened in many parts of the world too fast, too soon, and we had the second and third wave. But as we reopened and as we had a massive amount of monetary, fiscal, and credit stimulus and easing, there was a strong recovery in the third quarter of last year. So in the United States, the third quarter was an annualized growth rate of over 30%. And even in Europe, there was a strong recovery. However, as we reopened too soon, we had another second or third wave. And that second, third wave led to another round of lockdowns in Europe, US, and even without lockdowns, people became risk averse, people became more uncertain, they decided to spend less. That's why after the V-shaped recovery in the third quarter of last year, the fourth quarter was for US, a U-shaped recovery, growth of only 4% from 30% plus. And in the Eurozone, we saw actually a return to a double dip recession because growth in the Europe and the Eurozone became negative. In the fourth quarter, and looks even is going to be this way in the first quarter of this year. Now, if you look at market analysts and the pricing of the markets, people try to discount what has happened in the fourth quarter of last year and the first quarter of this year. And they say this was just a soft patch, a temporary one, or a temporary pothole, and why they think that there's going to be a stronger recovery of growth starting in the second quarter for a number of reasons. People say now we're going to be very successful to controlling the spread of the contagion, the spread of the virus. We're going to have better weather in the Northern Hemisphere. That implies maybe contagion is more limited. We have now massive distribution of a variety of vaccines. We still have very loose monetary, fiscal, and credit policies. Business, consumer, investor sentiment is improving. And in spite of the rise in long-term interest rates in the United States, financial conditions remain quite easy still. Equity markets are reaching new highs. Short rates are still close to zero, if not negative, like in Europe and Japan. And overall, credit spreads are very narrow. So most people believe that actually after this temporary soft patch or a pothole, there will be a strong recovery of growth. Now, whether the recovery is going to be a V, like the baseline of most analysts, or more of a dynamic U, or even the return to a double dip recession, a W, depends on a variety of factors, upside and downside risk. Some of them are short-term factors, some of them are more medium-term. Factor number one is, are we going to be in a world in which new strains of the virus are going to be spreading like wildfire? And are we going to be in a world in which we've had repeated stop-go cycles? We stop economic activity, then we reopen too soon, then we had a second wave, then we stopped again, then we'll go again, then we're going to stop again? Or are we going to be able to have a much more permanent, successful containment and control of the virus? In some parts of the world, like in China and parts of Asia, looks like the control of the virus is quite effective. In the UK, in Brazil, in parts of Europe, in South Africa, it's not the case. US cases peaked in January, they've collapsed, and now there is also a pickup as some of the new strains are also coming to the United States. So people are optimistic, but we have no idea of whether there'll be new strains and how spread they're going to be, and whether we're going to keep on doing these stop-go cycles, or whether finally we're able to contain the virus. Second question is whether the distribution of the vaccine is going to be slow and bumpy the way it's been in some parts of the world, and whether there'll be new vaccine-resistant strains that they cannot be essentially controlled with existing vaccines, or whether we have rapid and effective vaccination. And again, there are differences. You know, I was recently in Israel, where 2/3 of the population has been already vaccinated. In the UK, the number is close to 30%, US 20%, and of course, here in the UAE, very successful in terms of vaccinating most people. But if you go to the rest of Europe, whether you go into many emerging markets, the rate of vaccination are still very low, and they've been hampered by a whole bunch of problems. And therefore, the picture is much more difficult and bumpy. Third factor that's going to determine the shape of the recovery: is there a risk of a permanent scarring of jobs, of employment, of businesses, and what economists call hysteresis, that a temporary shock leads to a permanent loss of employment because you lose your skills, your human capital, there is stigma with remaining employed for too long, or whether there's going to be a robust recovery that's going to imply that the risk of permanent scarring or hysteresis are going to be contained. And again, the answer depends on which part of the world you're talking about. For some emerging market, this is not a pandemic recession, is what the World Bank has called a pandemic depression. A fourth factor is going to matter: are we going to be in a world in which there's going to be continued and persistent deleveraging by highly indebted either firms, SMEs, or even some large firms and some households, or whether we are in a world in which there has been now a massive buildup of savings, there is pent-up demand, and therefore we're going to see, once the virus is successfully controlled, a boom in economic activity and in consumption. A fifth factor: we've seen a rise in income and wealth inequality, and this income and wealth inequality, not only it has social political consequences, but it also redistributes income from labor to capital, from wages to profits, from households to corporates and the wealthy, and from those who tend to spend most of their income to those who tend to save more of it. And therefore it depresses aggregate demand. So inequality is not only bad socio-politically, but actually it hampers aggregate demand. So are we going to live in a world in which there is rising income and wealth inequality, depressing growth and demand? Or are we going to have more progressive policies that address this issue of inequality and therefore lead to an increase in consumption because you're increasing labor income? And the final factor, of course, is what's the extent of the monetary, fiscal, and credit stimulus? In the United States, we had $3 trillion of spending additionally last year. We just passed $1.9 trillion. And there's going to be an infrastructure plan that might have also investment, not just in physical, digital, and green infrastructure, but also into social and human capital. Some people worry that this is too much. It's going to lead to overheating, something we're going to be discussing. But if you do more of a macroeconomic stimulus, the growth recovery is going to be stronger. If you're doing less of it, the recovery is going to be weaker. Now, advanced economies have more monetary and fiscal space many emerging markets have limited capacity to macroeconomic easing, and therefore the recovery is going to be weaker. So those are 6 factors that determine in the short run the nature of the recovery. There are also a number of medium-term questions that you have to ask yourself. Are we going to live in a world, first of all, where there is going to be greater globalization and greater protectionism and restriction to trade in goods, in services, in capital, in labor, in technology, data, information? Or are we going to be able to control these inward-oriented policies that reduce trade, reduce potential growth, and increase the cost of production? Second factor, are we going to have an increasing Cold War between US and China? It's going to become colder. It's going to lead to a radical decoupling between US and China. Or are we going to have more of a managed strategic competition between US and China, where there is room for competing, but there is also room for cooperating? So in which kind of a world are we going to be living? Third factor, are we going to be in a world in which tech innovation will be stalling, given the US and China decoupling and given the backlash against big tech? Or are we going to have accelerated tech innovation, given there is so much new investment into the technologies of the future? And final variable is important is, are we going to live in a world in which there are greater political risks that leads to populism of the right and the left, and geopolitical risks that are worsening? Or are these tensions political and geopolitical contained, and therefore less damaging of a global economic activity? Now, if you look at all of these different variables, the answer on the shape of recovery is that most likely this recovery is going to be somehow uneven and differentiated, both within developed markets and emerging markets and across regions. You cannot lump everything together. US today is doing a massive stimulus, is going to likely to have a stronger recovery. China and a good part of emerging Asia is going to do well, because China is growing strongly, and the trade and supply chain links imply that if China does well, EM Asia is going to do well. However, the recovery in most of Europe is still weak. We've had a double-dip recession in the fourth quarter. There's going to be a negative growth in the first quarter. And even the hope that there'll be a V-shaped recovery like in US starting in the second quarter seem to be dashed by the fact that now there's a new wave of the contagion. There's new lockdowns, and therefore maybe strong recovery in Europe is going to be postponed until, say, the second half of this year, as opposed to the first half of the year. And as I pointed out, with the exception of emerging Asia, unfortunately, many other parts of emerging world, whether it's in Latin America, whether it's in sub-Saharan Africa, whether it's some parts of Central Europe, things don't look good. And of course, the MENA region is a complicated region where you have on one side oil and energy exporting countries that are also stable in terms of governance, like in the Gulf. But then you have many other countries like Egypt and others that are oil and energy importing, where there is massive unemployment and there are social political problems, let alone the fact that in the MENA region, unfortunately, there is also a number of either failed states or states that are at risk of be failing. Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Libya, potentially even Iraq. So you cannot, of course, generalize in this region. There are islands of stability like UAE and overall the Gulf, with some exceptions, but there are also many issues that are important, including how these economies that are oil and energy intensive are going to diversify away from oil and energy, because over the medium term, there'll be peak oil demand. Over the medium term, fossil fuels are going to be replaced by new types of fossil fuels like shale gas and oil, but more importantly by things like renewable energy, solar, wind, biomass, you name it. And therefore, medium term, I would say the real price of oil is going to be gradually falling. And therefore, I think everybody in the region realizes you have to diversify away from oil and energy. And of course, there are all these different plans, Vision 2030 and so on, from Saudi Arabia to the rest of the Gulf, of going in the direction of diversification. Those plans are all good idea. I think the question mark is about commitment to implementing them and implementing them right. Now, I think that one of the key issues that I think is on the mind of the investor right now is the question of inflation, on whether we're still going to be in a world where inflation both in advanced economies and emerging markets, is going to remain low, like it has been for the last 20 years, or whether there'll be a regime change. It's going to lead to a sharp increase in inflation and inflation getting out of hand. Now, the Fed in the US and other central banks say, don't worry, we're still in a world in which there is low inflation. We're still in a world in which there is still slack in goods and labor markets. We're still in a world in which any increase in inflation is going to be only temporary because of base effect, and we're going to be able to fight inflation successfully if and when we decide that we reach full employment and full capacity, and we have to exit things like quantitative easing or things like zero policy rates. However, my concern is that there are some forces that over time may lead to a rise in inflation that is not just temporary, but there's going to be a rise in inflation that's going to be slightly more permanent. And if that were to happen, there are significant economic and market and financial consequences of that. Point number one, the US stimulus is by any standard huge and excessive. As I pointed out, $3 trillion last year, 1.9 trillion just legislated, and another potentially $3 to $4 trillion of money that may be spent on infrastructure and also on social spending in the next 8 to 10 years. By any standard, this is massive, and it can lead to an overheating of the economy. And that's something that people worry about. That's one factor that might lead to a persistent rise in inflation rather than a temporary one. Secondly, we're starting to see supply bottlenecks in a number of industries, and we're going to have a reshoring of global supply chain as FDI moves away from China back to the United States and Europe and parts of the world where cost of productions are higher. And we're already seeing supply constraints in semiconductor chips, in pharma products, even in agricultural products. And some resource nationalism implies that countries are less willing to export, say, ag goods to other parts of the world as well. Three, we have had now persistent monetization of very large fiscal deficits. Budget deficits are high and rising, and central banks have gone to quantitative easing, credit easing, zero policy rates, negative policy rates, forward guidance. And while in the short run, persistent debt monetization, what people call even helicopter drop of money or MMT, leads to assets inflation rather than goods and service inflation. Over the medium term, this debt monetization, if persistent over time, leads to eventually goods and service inflation. And my fourth point, the risk that debt monetization is going to cause inflation becomes greater when you have a number of negative supply shocks that, if they materialize, reduce potential growth, increase the cost of production. And like in the 70s, when we had two major negative supply shocks that were the two oil shocks of 1973, Yom Kippur War, and 1979 Iranian Revolution, at that time we were behind the curve. We monetized large fiscal deficit, we didn't tighten monetary policy, and then inflation got out of control. And we got not only inflation, but also stagflation, recession and inflation. Now, this time around, the risk is not from oil shocks for a number of reasons. I don't think there'll be a massive spike in oil prices. It's going to be stagflation like the 1970s. But there are other forces that may result in negative supply shock. Force number one is the reversal of globalization and protectionism, fragmentation and balkanization of the global economy, and reshoring of FDI. Secondly, there is aging of population that implies there is less supply of labor, and labor that has been weak because of 2.5 billion Chinese and Indians joining the global labor supply for the last few decades. Now, supply of labor is shrinking not only in advanced economies, but also in China, in Russia, in Korea, and so key emerging markets. Three, we're going to have a decoupling between US and China. And a decoupling between US and China implies, again, restriction to mobility of labor, capital, goods, and services is reducing potential growth. And these, together with also restriction to the mobility of technology, can all push inflation higher. Now, central bank tells us, don't worry, if inflation gets above our targets, we're going to tighten monetary policy. But I fear that now we are in a world where central banks are less independent. And they're less independent because we're in a world in which there's a huge amount of private and public debt. Global debt of the private and public sector today is 360% of GDP, up from 200% in the year 2000. The number for advanced economies is even higher, 420. In emerging market is 250. In China is 330. And these debt ratios are not only high, but given the current trajectory of debt and leveraging the private and public sector, they're going to go even higher. Now, suppose you have a central bank and you reach full employment, and then you have to exit QE and you have to normalize policy rates, but you have huge amounts of private and public debt, and you start raising policy rates, then you can have shocks to financial markets, because these debt ratios are sustainable only as long as we have zero policy rates or negative policy rates on the short end, and we have very low long-term interest rates. But if instead we're going to normalize rates, and both short and long rates are going to go higher, those debt servicing ratios are going to become unsustainable. And if you ask yourself, will a central bank raise rates and cause a financial crash, first in bond markets, in credit markets, and then equity, and then an economic recession, or will then relent and decide to keep on monetizing to avoid that economic and financial crash, and therefore allow inflation to go higher? Unfortunately, the latter policy option becomes increasingly more likely than the former, meaning central banks are already in a world of what people refer to as fiscal dominance, where given the size of public and private debt, they cannot normalize rates, and therefore that eventually is inflationary. Couple of additional factors that may lead to inflation higher. COVID led to a rise in private savings and a wall of liquidity, as most of this extra liquidity was hoarded by corporates, households, and financial institutions. But once things are going to normalize and we're going to successfully fight COVID and we're going to have reopening, then you're going to get these savings. All of the savings are going to be saved. They're going to go into spending. And the velocity, that collapse of money, is going to be put at work. And credit growth is going to accelerate, and there'll be even more spending. So a rise in velocity and a rise of spending as opposed to this saving is going to lead to more spending, more growth, but also more inflation. Final factor that may lead to medium-term rise in inflation. China was key for global disinflation for the last 20 years, because Chinese joining the global labor supply implied a massive increase in the production of goods and services were cheap. Today, however, China is aging. And as China is aging, wage growth is accelerating. So the disinflationary effect of China are going to be fading out. So my main point here is that likely we're going to see inflation rising over time. Now, there are some counter arguments, and that's why there is a debate on what's going to be happening with inflation. Those who don't believe that inflation is going to go higher, but going to keep on staying low, make a number of arguments. They say a lot of this stimulus is not going to be spent, it's going to be saved because households that have a lot of arrears on their rents, on their utilities, they haven't paid their mortgages, their credit cards, and have to use the stimulus as a way of running down their arrears and their debts. Therefore, the growth impulse and the inflation impulse of the stimulus is going to be smaller. Two, some people argue that globalization had only a small role in the disinflation of the last 20 years. Three, demographic in US may lead older people to retire later because they have to keep on working because the pension are not enough. If they're going to retire later, that increase in the labor supply is going to keep NIRO, that is the structural unemployment rate, lower than otherwise. Four, people believe that the Fed may be able to resist the rise in inflation, maintain its independence and credibility, and tighten policy when necessary. Five, there may be still technological innovation will continue. It's going to lead to positive deflation coming from productivity in a variety of services. And finally, while aging reduces savings because all people spend more and save less, it also reduces investment demand and therefore reduces aggregate demand. So the net impact of aging on inflation may not be as inflationary. I think that on net, the factors that lead over time to inflation, I'm not speaking about this year, but if you take an horizon of the next 2 or 3 years, those factors that I stress that lead to inflation are going to be more important than the factors that keep inflation low. And if this thesis is true, then it has massive implication. Why? For the last 20 years, we have had a period of time where inflation was falling, long-term interest rates were falling, both in nominal and real terms, and you had a variety of positive supply shocks, globalization, opening up of China and emerging markets, technological innovation, positive demographic by having the labor supply from emerging market joining the global labor supply. And therefore, even when we're in full employment in the US and Europe and Japan in the last few years before COVID, in spite of the full employment, we didn't see inflation rising because of globalization, tech innovation, and of the supply of labor from emerging markets. Because of that, we had low interest rates in nominal real term, we had relatively great moderation in spite of the global financial crisis, and we had a global boom in a variety of asset prices, US and global equity, private equity, real estate, you name it. However, suppose that we are on the cusp of a regime change where demographics is going to go against you as there is aging of population. There is deglobalization. There is protectionism. There is a decoupling between US and China. There is even a backlash against big tech. There's a backlash against income and wealth inequality. And we're going to boost workers, unions, and wages, and we're going to tax rich, wealthy, and capital. All of these forces over time imply higher inflation, higher nominal interest rates, higher real rates. Why real? Because there is inflation volatility, and the rise of debts implies a rising sovereign risk premium, term premium, credit risk premium for private and public debts. And all this rise in nominal and real yields are going to lead to, instead of great moderation, to great macro volatility. And therefore, the risk is there'll be a bust in risky assets that are, by any standard right now, very, how to say, lofty in terms of valuation. Cyclically adjusted P ratios for US equities today are 33, 34, levels we've seen only before the Great Depression, 1928, or before the dot-com bust of 2000. So we are already in a situation in which many risky assets are overvalued. Liquidity and low interest rates are keeping them high in spite of that. But if there's going to be a shock to nominal and real interest rates, that could be a very, very different world. So to conclude, right now, financial markets are in risk on. US equity are reaching new high, and everybody is hoping that we're going to successfully contain the virus. We're going to be vaccinating everybody, and then maybe a strong V-shaped recovery in the global economy. But if you're looking at the medium term, you have to worry about monetization of fiscal deficit. You have to worry about deglobalization. You have to worry about decoupling between US and China. You have to worry about populism. You have to worry about geopolitical conflicts between US and China and the strategic allies of China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. And finally, you also have to worry about something I haven't touched upon, this global climate change. That's going to be severely disruptive in ways that are not fully yet assessed, but they'll be very, very damaging. Many parts of the world will be flooded. Many parts of the world will be too hot to live in them. And finally, one point on pandemic and COVID. This is not an exception. These zoonotic diseases that transfer from wildlife to livestock and human are in part occurring more frequently, more virulently, because we're destroying ecosystems via global climate change. And therefore, these wild animals, whether bats or pangolins or other that carry these very severe viruses, come in touch with livestock and humans. And this thing is happening more so because of global climate change. If you think about it, for the last 30 years, we've had first HIV, then we had SARS, MERS, bird flu, swine flu, Zika, Ebola, now COVID-19 that had a disastrous impact on the global economy, think about the losses of jobs, income growth, and God knows when we're going to have COVID-21 or 22 or 23. It's only a matter of time where another severe zoonotic pandemic is going to hit us unless we address these fundamental problems. So the outlook in the short run looks good, but I worry about many of the economic, debt, financial, political, geopolitical, technological, health, and environmental risks that are ahead of us that require both leadership at the national level and cooperation at the international level to be addressed successfully. So that's a warning about some of the medium-term risks that are looming ahead for us. And maybe I'll stop here and I'll happy to answer any question you might have. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Roubini. That was a lot to unpack and you did it very concisely, and I thank you. I want to jump into, Mr. McGowan has 3 questions, but I'd like to jump into his second question, which is how likely, if at all, is the international community to move away from the US dollar and adopt a cryptocurrency of some kind?
I think that those are, in some sense, 2 separate questions. One part of the question is more on whether these unquote cryptocurrencies are going to become currencies and monetary instruments. They're going to be replacing traditional currencies, whether the dollar, the euro, or otherwise. And the second one is whether the role of the US dollar as a major global reserve currency could be challenged by crypto, but could be also challenged by, say, the rise of China rather than crypto itself. You know, my view on crypto is that calling these cryptocurrencies currencies is a misnomer. It's a misnomer because honestly, any student of monetary theory knows that these are not currencies. They're not monetary instruments. For something to be a currency, it has to be a unit of account. Bitcoin or any other of these cryptocurrency are not unit of account. Nothing is priced in Bitcoin and is never going to be. Secondly, for something to be a currency has to be a scalable and widely used secure means of payment. With Bitcoin and proof of work, you can do 5 transactions per second. If you're using the Visa network, you can do 25,000 transactions per second. So it's not used as a means of payment, is not scalable. 3, a currency has to be a stable store of value, not just over wealth, but also over an index of the price of goods and services. You know, if my monetary unit can go up in value 20% or down 20% per day, you need something stable relative to the CPI index. Otherwise, it's not a good means of payment. And even vendors, I've gone to crypto conferences, they don't accept you pay the conference fees in Bitcoin because their entire profit margin, 20%, can be wiped out overnight by price of Bitcoin falling 20%. So why would any merchant want to use something where the profit margin is so volatile? You need something stable. And as a store of value over wealth is also highly speculative and highly, risky. And finally, for something to be a money, you need to have a single numerator so you can compare the relative price of 2 goods. You know, in a world of unquote tokenization, where you have a different token for every good and service, if I had to buy Coca-Cola with a Cola token and Pepsi Cola with a Pepsi token, I cannot even compare the relative price of 2 goods. You need a single numerator. You know, even the Flintstones had a more sophisticated financial system than Bitcoin because they were using shells as a single numerator, so you could compare the relative price of a Coke and a Pepsi or any goods or services. So they're not unit of account, they're not a scalable means of payment, they're not a stable store of value, they're not a single numerator. So literally calling them currencies is a misnomer. And by the way, it's only a matter of time when first the PBOC with the ERMB, then the ECB with the E-Euro, and eventually even the Fed with the E-Dollar, central banks are going to introduce central bank digital currencies. That implies that not just banks, but every individual, every business will have an account with the central bank. And therefore, for payment services, why should you use crypto, but why should you use even your bank account and your deposit for payments? You don't need any more private forms of money like bank deposits or even PayPal or Alipay, everybody's going to have an account with the central bank, and therefore you're going to have payment systems that are seamless, cheap, secure, instantaneous, with clearing and settlement to the central bank. So when a CBDC is going to be introduced, and it's only a matter of time, that's going to dominate not just crypto, that is not even a scalable payment system today, but also other forms of digital forms of payment system that today are very popular, AliChat, WeChat Pay, Venmo, PayPal, M-Pesa, you name it, because those central bank digital currencies are going to be better, more secure, and so on and so on. So I think that the idea that crypto is going to replace the US dollar is totally far-fetched. The threat to the US dollar is different. US today is running a very large twin fiscal and current account deficit. Last year, the current account deficit of US was 2.5% of GDP. The European and the Japanese have large budget deficit, but they have lots of private savings, and therefore they run a current account surplus, 2.5% of GDP in the case of the Eurozone. And the US deficits, twin deficits, are going to become larger because we'll have more of these savings of the public sector through larger deficits. They're going to go into the current account. So not only our current account is large, it's going to become larger. Whenever you have twin fiscal and current account deficit, your currency over time has to weaken because you're going to have to resolve your competitiveness problem through a dollar depreciation. And the only thing that was keeping the dollar strong in spite of the current account was that when the Fed was hiking rates until beginning of 19 and was doing quantitative tightening, then rising interest rates were leading to the capital account to an inflow of money into the United States, was keeping the dollar strong. But today the Fed has gone to zero. It's going to do QE for as far as I can see. They say we're not going to even hike rates until the first half of 2024. So you have twin deficits. You have very easy accommodated Fed. You have low interest rates that implies the capital inflows are not going to be there. You're going to have, as I pointed out, forces that lead to a rise in inflation in the United States. And final point, the biggest threat to the dollar as a global reserve currency is that the US today is using the US dollar as a tool of foreign national security. We're imposing, rightly or wrongly, sanctions against our strategic rivals, trade, financial, otherwise, technological, against China, Russia, Korea, Iran, you name it. And these countries are saying, why should I hold my reserves into dollar where you could freeze them, seize them, default them, and so on, right? If I owe you $1 billion, it's my problem. If I owe you $1 trillion, it's your problem. And therefore, the Chinese are starting, like the Russian and other, to diversify away from dollar assets. And they're going into things like gold, for example. And as they do that, and they're trying to build also an alternative financial and monetary system based on the ERMB, avoiding SWIFT, using their e-commerce and their payment system for other countries and their technologies, gradually, as we use the dollar as a tool of foreign policy, then eventually our strategic rival are going to decouple from the use of the dollar. And therefore, the use of the dollar might decline in global trading, financial, and reserve affairs as well. So I would say the biggest threat to the dollar as a reserve currency comes from rising China, twin fiscal and current account deficit, loose monetary policy, and the risk of inflation rising and eventually the debasement of the US dollar occurring. That's a greater risk than crypto.
Thank you so much. Another question, and let's turn towards America domestically here. Mr. McGowan says, Larry Summers maintains the Biden administration's infrastructure spending plan is highly irresponsible. However, Ken Rogoff, another respected economist, argues that the Biden plan is okay and necessary. So Mr. McGowan would like to know, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, you know, if I understand correctly the view of Larry Summers, actually, his concern is that while we do need a large infrastructure plan, his concern is that as we pass the $1.9 trillion of a stimulus that is going to households and the poor and is affected, then we're doing something that's going to overstimulate the economy and is going to lead to a rise in inflation and maybe the political capital then to spend pass another $2 trillion on necessary infrastructure is not going to be there. So he has been supportive of infrastructure spending. He's been less supportive of essentially transfer of money to households that already have a lot of savings and the risk of overheating of the economy. While other economists, of course, like Ken Rogel, but also Janet Yellen and others have said, we need the stimulus because there are still many SMEs and households that are fragile and they need a boost to their income in order to jumpstart economic growth. You know, I think the answer to this debate is, honestly, we don't know yet. Some people argue that the growth and inflationary impulse is not going to be so small, so large, because maybe only a third of the stimulus is going to be spent. You have millions of US households that have not paid the rent for a year. They've not paid the electricity, utility bills, internet, cable, phone, you name it, and they haven't paid their mortgages, credit cards, student loans, auto loans. So the bailout of the household is actually a bailout of the banks and those who lend to the household, because if they use most of the money to run down their arrears and their debts rather than spending, first of all, the growth impulse is going to be smaller, the inflation impulse is going to be smaller, and the bailout of the household is a bailout of the banks and the creditors, and it's going to narrow credit spreads. That's one view, that most of it is going to be saved to deleverage rather than spent. Others, however, argue that, yeah, in the short run, some of it is going to be saved, but over time, as you run down your debts, and then you have a still significant amount of increase in disposable income, there'll be a growth of spending that in an economy is going to get close to full employment, eventually is going to be inflationary. And then the second part of the debate is whether the Fed then is going to actively try, once we reach full employment, to try to exit this unconventional policy and normalize. And the Fed says, trust me, I'll do it, as opposed to those who say, given the stocks of private and public debt, it's going to be mission impossible, and the Fed is going to have to keep on monetizing, because otherwise you get an economic and a financial crash. So the honest answer is you can have both views. In the short run, I think inflation is going to be still controlled because we still have slack in goods and labor market. But I think that the extent of the stimulus, the type of negative supply shocks that I talked about, and persistent monetization of fiscal deficit can be inflationary over the medium term, something that we have to start as investors to worry about.
Thank you. Another question from Mr. Zahir. What is your evaluation and opinion of the proposal by current chair Janet Yellen for a global corporate tax rate?
Well, I mean, what's going on is that the US, that has this very large deficit, has to financing them. And financing them with debt or monetizing them eventually has a variety of economic and financial risk. And we're not going to be able to actively cut spending because the political pressure to spend more, including on healthcare because of COVID. And because of the rise of inequality, there is a need to redistribute income to those who are poor, unemployed, disaffected. And therefore, spending policies are going to become more progressive. So eventually you have to raise taxes. And the question, which taxes you rise, and the result is going to be, whether you like it or not, that the corporate tax rate is going to go up from 21 maybe to 28%, that various types of loopholes on the guilty tax are going to be phased out, that the marginal tax rates on high income individuals is going to rise, that capital gains tax may be a tax as ordinary income for those who are rich, and so on and so on. Now, since capital is mobile, if you're increasing your tax rates a lot and the rest of the world is having very low tax rates, then capital is going to flow out of the United States because there is this tax arbitrage. And the OECD and the US have been talking for a lot for the last few years about the need to essentially harmonizing tax rates globally. So there is not that type of a tax arbitrage. And the European wanted to, for example, impose a digital tax on US tech firms that are paying very little and so on. So there's a need for revenue. And among advanced economies, there is a recognition that whether you like it or not, some increase in taxation of the corporate and the wealth is going to be necessary. But the wealth and the corporates are highly mobile in terms of capital flows. So you need a global minimum tax to prevent that type of a tax arbitrage. And even in the UK, where you have a Tory administration in power, they just also decided that they want to raise the corporate tax rate because you have very large fiscal deficits. So I think that there may be a consensus among the G20, and doesn't matter whether you're a center right, center left, that probably some minimum global kind of corporate tax is necessary to avoid excessive amount of tax arbitrage. And we'll see whether an agreement along those lines can be reached. I think is likely to be reached.
Another question from Mr. Rosholt. His question is, on our US tax policy changes, do you see any potential changes to the FEIE, foreign earned income exemption, the FEIE benefits as expats? Do you see any changes, Dr. Roubini?
You know, I've not followed that particular kind of debate, so I'm not sure exactly whether the proposal of the administration are going to change that particular tax treatment or not. So it's something on which I've not thought about. So I don't want to give the wrong answer on it.
Thank you for your honesty. So it seems we've gone through all of our questions, and I want to give you a few moments if you wish to just give a quick summary of your thoughts, maybe for what we should be hopeful for and not fearful of. I always like to leave on a high note, but what do you think we should be most hopeful for in the next 2 to 3 quarters?
Well, you know, in the next few quarters, I would say the positive is that hopefully we're going to be able to contain the spread of the virus and stop these second, third, fourth waves. And 2, we'll be able to vaccinate increasingly more and more people. Some countries are already successful. Hopefully, as we produce more, emerging markets, Europe and so on, are going to have access. So we're going to really be able to successfully control and then fight this virus once and for all. If that happens, things will reopen in US, in China, in Asia, in Europe, in the Middle East, in emerging markets, gradually, sequentially. And we're going to gradually go back to some modicum of normal economic activity, of being able to travel for business, for tourism, of doing trade, you know. Just moving around for the last few weeks from US to Israel, from Dubai to here. Next I have to go to Saudi and then Greece. Every time I leave a country, I need to do a PCR test. Every time I enter a country, I have to do another PCR test. I've been vaccinated 3 months ago, but no country accepts my vaccination from the US, even if it's the same vaccine that everybody else is using. So we need an international passport for vaccines so the people are vaccinated can move around without having to quarantine for 10 days in Dubai before they get into Abu Dhabi, for example. And this is the same country, by the way, but you have restriction even to mobility within the same nation, just to give you an example of how. And even US, mobility restriction from Florida to New York or from California to other parts. This is the level of restriction that occurred that have really hampered business and economic activity, one way or another. And hopefully there'll be a recovery of economic growth. Hopefully it's going to be a V-shaped recovery. And hopefully, in my view, the positive medium long term is that technology can really help resolve many problems of growth, of productivity, of global climate change, and so on. So technology can be a force for a good economic change. It will be increasingly a world based on knowledge, on technology, and on innovation, if it's used in the right way. But then, as I said, we're in a world of high private and public debt, of risk of debt crisis, of financial crisis, of return to inflation, of populism, of geopolitical risk, of health risk, of environmental risk. So there's a lot to be done. Technology can help you, but also you need good leadership and good governance, like the ones that, for example, we see in places like Dubai, Abu Dhabi, that are success stories. So you need good leadership, you need technology, you need leadership in the public sector, you need leadership in the private sector to address this concern and risk and to make the world a better world and a more sustainable and a more inclusive world as well. So we can do it, but it takes a lot of work.
Well, as my mom liked to say, nothing good is ever easy. So I agree with you. There's a lot of work ahead. Dr. Roubini, on behalf of our attendees here today, I cannot thank you enough. This was a wonderfully salient and very in-depth conversation. We thank you for having the time in your busy schedule to visit with AmSham Abu Dhabi. And I would like to extend a welcome visit back to us at any time. Hopefully we can see you in person on your next journey here back to the UAE. So safe travels to your next few stops, and a special thanks to James Ruiz, one of our AmSham members, who was so kind to connect us together today and have this event. So everyone, wish you a blessed and wonderful weekend. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you again soon from AmSham Abu Dhabi. Dr. Roubini, safe travels to you, sir. Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you all. It was a pleasure. I hope to see you all in person at some point next trip.
God
Thanks
bless
again.
you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.